Good afternoon, everyone. Talking today about neurochemistry. The hormones I want to talk about are cortisol and testosterone, and then really the neurotransmitter to talk about is serotonin. Now, this is not a biology class. Okay, I'm going to give you some basic foundations to help make sense of the concepts we're talking about, to give you some context. But if you've already done a course like physiological psychology or some other biological psychology course, you already have superior foundation than what I'm going to provide you with. So, talking about hormones, first of all, which are chemical messengers, they are transported around the body in the bloodstream, directly secreted into the bloodstream by various glands, right? These are the endocrine glands making up the endocrine system. The pituitary gland, as I'm sure you've heard of, is the master gland. So most hormones are secreted here, or if they are secreted elsewhere, the pituitary gland sends a message to that gland to secrete. So the main one we're going to talk about is cortisol, which is the stress hormone. It's produced in response to stress. It's secreted in the adrenal glands on the top of the kidneys, but a signal is sent first to the adrenal glands from the pituitary gland. Yeah. The hypothalamus also, in a sense, oversees all of this. Because remember, the hypothalamus is involved in initiating behaviors to do with basic motivations. You know, in intro to psych, you've probably heard the 4 F's to help you remember what the hypothalamus does. So that's anything to do with feeding, anything to do with fighting, anything to do with flight, running away, and then the 4th F, that means sex, right? These are the 4 F's, right, that are tied to the hypothalamus. Anything to do with them, it originates in the hypothalamus. So these hormones are pretty amazing, really, because they are transported around the bloodstream and they know exactly where they're going. They bind to particular target organs, target cells, and they are involved in gene translation, okay, meaning that they either trigger or suppress some gene expression, okay, once it's bound to the target cell or target organ. So cortisol is the main one I want to talk about, okay, which is the stress hormone. So it's regulated by the HPA axis, okay, which is basically the body's regulatory system for stress. Okay, and this is how the HPA axis looks. This is the various components. This is what the process looks like. So as I just alluded to, it begins with the hypothalamus, right? That will identify a reason for a stress response, some threat in the environment, something that's anxiety evoking, right? To begin the chain reaction, okay, of eventually releasing this stress hormone. So it first of all produces CRF, which is the chemical messenger that it sends to the pituitary gland, okay? And then once this binds to the pituitary gland, this secretes ACTH, which is its chemical messenger, and it goes to the adrenal glands on the ends of the kidneys, okay? Then continuing on the message to produce cortisol, right? And this is where the cortisol is then secreted, okay? Secreted directly into the bloodstream, okay, once it receives this particular chemical messenger. Once cortisol is secreted, there's a negative feedback loop so that the brain can keep track of how much cortisol is being produced, in part because the effects of cortisol are pretty dramatic. It has a physiological effect on your appetite, on your heart rate, on all the other features of a stress response, of anxiety, right? Now, as it's transported around the bloodstream, it's also sent to target particular parts of the brain, 3 parts of the brain in particular. Okay, the amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex. Okay, it's binding to these parts of the brain, stimulating activity in these parts of the brain. Now, next week, I'm going to go over the various parts of the brain in detail, but you probably have a basic idea on these parts already. The amygdala is the center point for emotion, right? It's where fear conditioning occurs. It's really the center point for any emotional response. Okay. The hippocampus is involved in consolidation, the learning new skills, learning new information, okay, memorizing. And the prefrontal cortex is that frontal area of the frontal lobe. It's involved in sophisticated functions, advanced cognitive abilities like problem solving, decision making, impulse control, planning ahead. Okay. It's the newer part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective, right? It's the part that keeps a lid on the more emotional, animalistic parts of the brain, okay? And is responsible for these more advanced functions that we have. So if you have a stress response, why might it be good to activate these parts of the brain in particular? Well, we might want an emotional response, because if it's a threat, for example, then we know that having emotion tied to the event makes it more likely that we'll remember it, okay? It makes the experience more profound, more memorable. We want the hippocampus because perhaps we want to keep track of what led to this consequence. You know, why did we get this punishment? Why did we get this threat? How can we avoid this in the future, right? We might want to be consolidating some information here, learning from mistakes. And you likely, if you're experiencing a threat, want to make a good decision. You want to be able to plan ahead and think, well, what's going to happen if I do this versus this? You want to have, you know, somewhat of a cool head so that you can think clearly. So a little bit of cortisol exposure is good for stimulating activity in these parts of the brain. But the brain can very quickly become overwhelmed if there is too much cortisol exposure. If there's too much cortisol exposure, it then has a negative impact on these parts of the brain. Okay. So this is the difference, right, between being somewhat more alert, paying more attention to things because you're a little bit stressed and you're taking this seriously, you know that this is serious, versus getting to the point in which you're overwhelmed and you're so overridden by anxiety and stress that you just can't think clearly, right? If you've taken my forensic psych course, when we talk about eyewitnesses, we know that there's an optimal level of stress for memory when it comes to witnesses to a crime, right? A little bit of stress increases the odds that they'll remember more because they're paying close attention, they're more alert, okay? But there then comes a point in which they're overwhelmed, and that's the difference between the witness who says, I'll never forget that face, I remember all so clearly, versus the witness who says, it was all a blur, I don't remember anything, I couldn't recognize the face, right? There comes a point in which there is overwhelming versus this optimal level of arousal, if you like. And probably you can relate to that in your own life as well, right? Sometimes you're maybe feeling the pressure and you're, you know, taking this seriously, thinking clearly, and then there comes a point maybe when you're so nervous, so anxious, which means you just can't think straight, right? And your memory is also impaired. Like maybe when doing a test, for example, if you get really bad test anxiety. Or maybe when interviewing for a job, right? Maybe it's high stress, and then maybe afterwards you don't really remember the questions you were asked so well, because it's all now kind of a blur, because it was a high stressful situation. Now, talking about animal studies, first of all, we have good evidence here, okay, that cortisol is relevant to aggressive and dominant behavior. So in baboons, for example, those who are higher in dominance in the hierarchy have lower levels of cortisol. And those with higher levels of cortisol are more subordinate. Also, if we take the most aggressive and dominant baboons and then look within that subgroup of differing levels of cortisol, the most aggressive of the most aggressive have the least cortisol. Okay, so we're even in that subgroup finding the same pattern. Well, this is, of course, non-human research. Okay, people are biologically different or psychologically different. Okay, and some of the brain pathways are similar, some of the biological pathways are the same. So it can be a good starting point, okay, for identifying associations between biology and behavior that then means you can further explore this. And in human studies, we do in fact have good evidence, at least from correlational research, that low cortisol corresponds with more aggressive tendencies. Okay. Overall, it's a moderate to strong effect. Okay. That's -0.4, right? It's a moderate verging on strong effect. Okay. Meaning that the lower cortisol is, the more likely it is that one will be more aggressive. Now, we have various sources of evidence for this that all point really in the same direction. So we have a group of 6 to 12-year-olds with a diagnosed conduct disorder, and they have significantly lower rates of cortisol than their peers who don't have a conduct disorder. We have 10 to 14-year-old boys with externalizing behavior, which includes symptoms of a conduct disorder, difficulty regulating emotions. Again, lower levels of cortisol. Teenage boys with the same symptoms, again, lower levels of cortisol. We have teenage girls now diagnosed with a conduct disorder, again, significantly lower rates rather of cortisol than their peers. A group of female inmates, again, significantly lower rates of cortisol. And then when we make the effort of separating proactive aggression from reactive aggression, it seems to be more proactive aggression that low levels of cortisol are connected to, rather than reactive aggression. Why do you think that might be? First of all, what is proactive aggression in comparison to reactive aggression? Yeah.
Pre-planned, premeditated.
Exactly, yeah. It's premeditated plans, more calculating, more cold-blooded. So with that type of violence, why might low cortisol be connected to that specifically, rather than more defensive, reactive aggression? Yeah.
Well, I would think that like reactive aggression wouldn't be as correlated with low cortisol because it requires you to like respond really quickly, which is more similar to like a fight or flight response
Okay.
that cortisol triggers.
Okay. How can we explain the proactive aggression? Why might it be connected to that?
In regards to low cortisol levels, they're maybe experiencing that reduction of cortisol for a period of time. So that aggression is constant instead of, what's the word? Just sudden in regards to reactive.
Okay.
It's a constant boil of, having that low hormone. So they're living in the aggression and the violence.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, let's think about what it means if you have a low level of cortisol, you have a low stress response, right? So if you have this low level of stress, okay, even in response to situations that would normally be frightening or inducing anxiety, why might it be likely that you're more likely to go ahead, with proactive aggression? Yeah.
They wouldn't suffer the same kind of like emotional reparations that someone who might feel bad would.
Okay. Or before the event, if you're getting stressed, you're more likely to be worried about consequences, right? If I get into a fight with this person, what if I get hurt? If I try to rob this store, what happens if it goes wrong? You're getting stressed, right, at the idea of doing something wrong. And that comes with it physiological responses, right? If you're not really experiencing that change in physiology, okay, you're not really getting deterred in the same way that a typical person would be by the feelings of stress, okay? So it might be then more likely that you go ahead with the criminal intent or aggressive behavior. In terms of what causes low cortisol, chronic stress early in life is really the clearest factor that predicts chronically low levels of cortisol in adulthood. We have good evidence of this from the Romanian orphanage studies. You're maybe familiar with this from developmental psych. If you've taken my forensic psych or personality course, we go into it. But to give you a quick rundown, Romania was ruled by a dictator who believed that the way to maximize economic growth would be to accelerate the population as quickly as possible. So all abortions were made illegal, all contraception was made illegal, all women were told you have to have this many children by this age, otherwise there'll be financial penalties. The consequence was the families had more children than they could care for. They didn't have the resources to feed all of the children. Children were being abandoned, they were being left on streets, they were being left on the doorsteps of orphanages, especially if they had a medical condition, which would be even further costly. And by 1989, the orphanages were completely overburdened. Okay, they didn't have the resources to feed all of the children. They were malnourished, they were starving. They didn't have the staff to care for all of these children. They were left alone for days at a time in cribs. There was no one-on-one contact, there was no stimulation. And there's been a number of studies, right, looking at what the developmental consequences were of being raised in such horrific circumstances. But one finding is that it's predicting chronically low levels of cortisol, okay, even in adulthood. One way of measuring this is your daytime cortisol decrease. So for effectively everyone, your cortisol is at its highest when you first wake up, and then there's a gradual decline in your cortisol levels as the day goes on. It's at its lowest when you're feeling tired, ready for bed, then it resets during the night. But for these individuals, the decrease was much quicker after waking up and was much more like a plummet, right? More sudden decrease, a drastic decrease. Other chronic stress early in life, like neglect, abuse, also can predict chronically low levels of cortisol. Keep in mind that the brain adapts. If you're experiencing something that's highly stressful continuously, like a horrible home life, okay, that's causing a stress response daily, maybe multiple times a day, that's overwhelming for the brain. The brain can't keep having that stress response over and over again. So eventually your physiological response to stress is blunted, right? You don't have the same kind of arousal, the same kind of physiological response to a stressful situation. Depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, other psychological trauma, these also can predict low levels of cortisol, abusing substances. If you suddenly stop smoking, giving up cigarettes, cold turkey, then that predicts low levels of cortisol for around at least 5 to 6 weeks. So why might it be that low cortisol is associated with antisocial behaviors? Okay. The first point here I kind of covered already. It's this idea that your stress reactivity is reduced, okay? So you don't have the same biological deterrence, if you like, that a typical person would at the idea of doing something antisocial. You don't get the same level of stress. The other point is that if you experience these early stresses that I showed you on the previous slide, like severe neglect or abuse, something that causes high stress responses for a time in your early development, high cortisol exposure. High cortisol exposure has serious detrimental effects on the hippocampus. Okay, it shrinks the hippocampus drastically in size, and then the hippocampus is less functional. Okay, so and those who experience severe neglect, abuse, conditions like in the Romanian orphanages, okay, the hippocampus is going to be structurally impaired, functionally impaired. Okay, so keep in mind the hippocampus is the part of the brain involved in consolidation, memorizing, learning new skills, okay, learning new information. Why might it be if this part of the brain is impaired that you might be more likely to be criminal or antisocial? Yeah.
Like you might not have learned some of like the social deterrents that most people would have, like you might not have learned like pro-social behavior.
You just might not have learned as well, might not learn from consequences, learn social rules, and so on. Yeah, good points.
So maybe they just don't stress about the consequences, like they're fine with the consequences and they're just like, okay, like just get this over with and I'll just continue with my life, because that didn't really affect me from the beginning.
Okay, and also if you're not really learning from mistakes and consequences, then that's going to play a part. Yeah, anything else? I mean, if your ability to memorize and learn is impaired, you're going to do worse at school, right? So on average, you're going to struggle more in school. You're likely going to have more acting out issues in school, more likely to be, what's the word when you're removed from school? Expelled. You might be less likely to graduate, you might be more likely to drop out, less likely to go to college, right? All of this might limit your opportunities, and might have you more agitated at the fact that you're struggling on the schoolwork and other people aren't, right? All of that also might, propel you into a criminal pathway or be more likely to be antisocial. The stimulation-seeking hypothesis and fearlessness hypothesis, we can also bring into it. The fearlessness hypothesis I've kind of already described, okay, but it's when you have this disposition for fearlessness, you're more likely to go ahead with antisocial behaviors and criminal behaviors because you don't have the same concerns, worries, anxiety, increase in heart rates at the idea of doing something wrong, right? You're not fearing the consequences as much. The stimulation-seeking hypothesis is looking at it from the other angle. It's arguing that if you have chronically low levels of arousal, that's uncomfortable. It makes you feel almost like you're not alive, like nothing's really increasing your heart rate, nothing's getting you going, nothing's exciting you, right? There's no arousal on a physiological level, and that can be uncomfortable. You're all aware, likely, that there's an optimal level of arousal, right? Sometimes you feel over-aroused, you kind of want to calm down, retreat, have time to yourself. Sometimes you feel under-aroused, and maybe you want some caffeine or something to give you a bit of a kick, okay? So this might explain why those with an antisocial personality disorder are substantially more likely to be higher in risk-taking, stimulation-seeking, engage in a number of reckless, risk-taking activities like dangerous driving, okay? It might be that they're looking for something to increase their arousal levels, increase their heart rates, okay, to make them feel more alive, to give them a rush. And it takes something more extreme, okay, in order to experience that, which might be in line with certain antisocial behaviors. Okay, questions so far?
So if you have too high cortisol levels or too low cortisol levels, you can have an increase in aggression.
It's really the chronically low levels of cortisol that predict it, but it seems to be a reason for chronically low levels of cortisol in adulthood is if you have substantial trauma or stress early in life, which would come with it elevated cortisol exposure,
Okay,
and it comes at such a high level that there's going to be negative effects from that.
Does this also go for antisocial like personality disorder? Is that the same thing, just more extreme, or is it more like antisocial tendencies?
Well, yes, that's included too, because we looked at conduct disorders, which are the precursor to antisocial personality disorder. We looked at aggression. So it would also include that. Yeah. Okay. The other hormone to discuss is testosterone. Okay. It's an androgen, meaning it has masculizing effects. Okay. For crucial for building protein tissue, building muscle mass, which is why sometimes testosterone boosters are used by athletes to try and get ahead, right? Because it might improve performance. First of all, let me talk about the relationship to animals again. In this case, we have cause and effect evidence. When I talked about cortisol, it was all correlational. Okay. But with testosterone, there's not just correlational research, there's actually some evidence of causation. Okay. Because we know if we remove the testes, we castrate an animal, then across many species, there's a reduction in aggression. Right? That's why many people castrate their dogs, right? To reduce the likelihood of aggression. But also, if we give them a testosterone replacement, testosterone boost, okay, it does the opposite. It increases aggression, okay? Again, demonstrating some cause and effect. But it's not as simple as testosterone being higher and therefore directly necessarily leading to aggressive behaviors, okay? And a study here that demonstrates that is in mice. So we measure their aggressive tendencies, in this case by their unprovoked biting. We measure that before castration, then we measure it after castration, and then we measure it after giving a testosterone boost, okay? On average, there's the pattern that you would expect, a reduction after castration, an increase again after the testosterone boost. But it's only the mice who were already aggressive before castration who become aggressive again once given the testosterone boost, okay? The mice who are not highly aggressive beforehand don't suddenly become aggressive after getting the testosterone boost, okay? What I'll show you in some other studies is that testosterone does often make one more assertive. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll be in a violent, aggressive way, okay? It's possible to be assertive in a more pro-social way, okay? So does high testosterone relate to aggressive personalities? Yes, it does. We have large meta-analyses that have looked at all the studies being done, and the average across those studies correlation is small, okay, but it's reliably found. It's 0.15, that's the correlation. So small positive correlation between aggression and testosterone. It's comparative to the correlation between smoking and getting cancer. It's comparative to the correlation between being abused as a child and then acting criminally once you're an adult. Okay, it's a small relationship, but it's reliably found. It's consistent. There is some evidence that the relationship is larger if we use observational reports, peer reports, rather than self-reports, okay? Indicating that sometimes people might kind of not be entirely honest, right? If they're self-reporting crimes, self-reporting antisocial, aggressive tendencies, behaviors, okay? So the effect or relationship might be larger, okay, if we use a more potentially objective measurement. Is high testosterone linked to aggressive crimes? Yes, violent criminals have a higher baseline rate of testosterone on average than non-violent criminals and in comparison to the general public. Is it linked to antisocial behavior? Yes. In this study of nearly 4,500 US servicemen, those who were higher in testosterone were more likely to behave aggressively, antisocially, okay, rather than the other servicemen. And again, violent inmates score higher in testosterone on average than their fellow inmates, okay, who are lower in testosterone. Some other questions. Does testosterone promote status? Okay. Yes, it does seem to encourage aggressive or pro-social behavior, depending upon the context. The study here is maybe being a little bit loose in how they're defining pro-social behavior, but it's effectively what's happened in the study is there are a number of teams, they're all competing in a number of sports and exercises with other teams. Those who were higher in testosterone were much more competitive. They were more likely to hurl verbal assaults at the other teams, okay, which would be the aggression part. But they were also more encouraging of their teammates. If their teammate was taking part in a competition, they would be more likely to shout encouragements, okay, and to congratulate them, well done, afterwards, which they're calling pro-social behavior. But again, it's social assertiveness, right, which again can manifest differently depending upon the context. It also predicts economic aggression. In this study, they've looked at what that means from a number of different angles. So those who were higher in testosterone were more likely to take higher financial risks. So meaning maybe choosing an option for investment that has, yes, high risk, but also potentially high reward, right? They're also less fair in negotiations with other participants. They are more selfish in those negotiations, okay? And they're more willing, okay, to take money in the economic game with the participants. They're more likely to take the money from the other participants, okay, in order to have it for themselves, okay? All of which we're classing as forms of economic aggression. A number of studies have also found that those with an aggressive occupation are higher in testosterone. So in 3 different samples, football players had higher levels of testosterone on average than churchmen. Marriage and fatherhood seem to lower testosterone levels. Male executives had higher levels of testosterone on average, managers and CEOs, in comparison to their subordinates. There were higher testosterone levels in men who were self-employed versus those who had an employer. And when we looked at a sample of financial traders, testosterone predicted daily profits, okay, being more successful on a given day. Using 2 measurements of testosterone, okay, your morning testosterone levels, which we can measure with a blood sample, done in the morning because that's when testosterone is at its highest typically. And also looking at the 2D/4D ratio. If you don't know what this is, I'm going to come back to it in more detail. Okay. But it's effectively measuring your second finger in comparison to the 4th finger, because that tells you something about how much testosterone you were exposed to during fetal development. Are these testosterone aggression relationships found in children? Not before puberty, not before around age 15, in fact. Okay. We have 5 different studies here that have all found there were no effects prior to puberty. And we have a group here of 15 to 17-year-olds, higher testosterone predicted more physical, overt aggression, and also more verbal aggression. 15 to 17-year-olds again linked to violent offences. Okay. So this just illustrates the age-related effects. Okay. So in the red line, we have the more aggressive individuals. The blue line is the non-aggressive participants. There's no real significant difference in testosterone on the y-axis before and including really age 15. And then after that, we have a substantial difference, okay, between the two groups in testosterone levels. Let's also look at the differing levels of testosterone between males and females. As you'll know, males have higher levels of testosterone. That's the higher up line here. The lower line is the age-related trends of testosterone for females. Okay. So it's lower levels of testosterone continuously. Could this help explain some of the sex differences in crime? Keeping in mind that for every violent female offence, there's 9 violent male offences. Okay. Probably not the only factor. Okay. I'm going to go on to explain other biological factors that might be part of the puzzle. And of course, there's going to be social, cultural factors as well. But this is likely one part of the puzzle. What I want you to do here is, for a moment, look at this line, okay, which is the age-related trends in testosterone for males. You'll see it peaks at around age 20, begins to decline around age 25, and then really continues to decline, okay? Now compare that to how likely you are to commit a crime based upon age for males. You'll see that it mirrors very, very well the pattern of testosterone levels across the ages. Again, around age 20, late teens, early 20s is when men are most likely to commit crimes. Again, their likelihood of committing crimes decreases at around age 25. And again, it's a fairly steady decrease. Okay. Again, giving some credibility to the argument that testosterone might be helping explain why there's a peak in crime at this particular age in comparison to other ages. Again, adding to the argument, right, that testosterone likely has some part to play. And what I've told you so far is correlational research. Okay? And by this point in your studies, you should know that correlation does not imply causation, right? But unlike with cortisol, rather, when it comes to testosterone, we do have examples of cause and effect. One way of researching this is with children who have delayed puberty. Okay, so some children suffer from delayed puberty. Some of those children undergo hormonal therapy in order to kick off their puberty so that they don't fall too far behind in comparison to their peers. Okay, they're given no boosts of the hormones that they're lacking. So testosterone for males, estrogen for females. Okay. Now in this study, we have a group of children who have experienced delayed puberty. Some of them receive the hormonal therapy and some do not. See if there's a difference between those two groups. Okay. And for both males and for females, those who received the hormonal therapy, so the boosts to kick off their puberty, significantly higher levels of aggression, okay, for both the boys and for the girls in comparison to the other group. Okay. That's one example of some cause and effect. Okay. We're controlling for all the other variables. Children who are exposed to more testosterone during fetal development also end up with more aggressive tendencies. And also it's true if they have higher levels of testosterone shortly after birth. Pay attention though to this study here, which is a randomized placebo-controlled trial, which is the gold standard really for clinical trials for testing a new medication, for example, to see if it actually has an effect in reducing symptoms right? So this is as close as we can get basically to demonstrating causality. Yeah. So in this study, right, we have a group of controls, okay, who receive nothing. We have a group who receive a testosterone boost, and then we have a group who receive a placebo, right? They think they're receiving a testosterone boost, but in fact, they're not receiving anything. Okay. We're then measuring how they behave on the point subtraction aggression paradigm, or PSAP. I'm going to reference this a few times in the class, okay, because it's one way of measuring reactive aggression. Yeah. So what happens in this measurement for measuring reactive aggression? You have a participant come into the lab. You're told you're playing a game against some other participant, okay? And when you win the game, you can either add points to yourself or you can take points away from the other participant, okay? And you want to get as much points as you can in order to complete the game and to win the game, okay? But what happens is this other participant starts hurling insults at you. You get messages on your screen from the other participant telling you, haha, you suck at this, or no, you're awful, or some message that's designed to kind of provoke you and wind you up. And you're thinking, well, what's up with this, right? I'm just signing up for a research study, okay? Either because I saw a poster and decided to sign up, or I'm doing it for extra credit if I'm a student, right? Why am I having these insults hurled at me, okay? But there isn't actually another participant, it's a computer, okay? And the computer's trying to get you agitated, it's trying to get you provoked, it's trying to see if you'll retaliate, okay? So when you win on the next game and you have the choice between adding points to yourself or subtracting points from the other person, if you choose to subtract, then that's evidence of retaliation, okay, which we're taking here as evidence of reactive aggression. Now, what we found is that reactive aggression using this model does increase for the group receiving the testosterone boost in comparison to the controls, in comparison to the placebo, okay? But only so long as they continue to receive the testosterone boost, okay? After 5 weeks of treatment, so once testosterone goes back to its baseline rate that it was at before the experiment, then the reactive aggression again decreases, okay? So there's only this increase during the time of having the testosterone and in that one group, okay, which is pretty good evidence of cause and effect. It's also worth pointing out that the amount of testosterone in these boosts in this study was comparatively very minimal in response to, for example, illicit users, okay, who use it as means of getting ahead in sports, for example. Okay. So even with this comparatively small amount, we're still getting good evidence, okay, of causality. So why might testosterone be linked to aggression? Well, first of all, it's not as simple as testosterone then just equaling aggressive behavior. It's more of a cycle, right? Because your environment also impacts your testosterone levels. If you're in a competitive environment, your testosterone increases. And when inmates are put into prison, the prison environment actually increases their testosterone levels, okay, because it's a dangerous competitive environment. If you win at a game, win at a competition, that increases your testosterone levels. Whereas if you lose, the opposite occurs, and you experience a reduction in testosterone. So might this stimulate wanting to compete, wanting to further dominate after receiving this increase in testosterone from previous success, right? It's like a cycle. So testosterone is really as much the result of violence as it is the cause, right? If someone is getting into a fight and they get the other upper hand and they win at the fight, they're going to get an increase in testosterone because they just proved themselves dominant. If they plan out a crime like a robbery and they're successful and they get away with it, they're going to feel, pretty dominant again and pretty good about themselves. And again, that's going to come with it an increase in testosterone. How many of you are familiar with the 2D, 4D ratio? So it was popular to study it in relation to sexual orientation for a while. And more recently, it's been studied in relation to aggressive behavior. It's another measurement for testosterone, but this time it's measuring how much testosterone you were exposed to during fetal development, okay? During fetal development, you have testosterone exposure, particularly during the 10th and 18th week. And it also is the case that during this period of fetal development, your fingers develop, okay? So what we see is a pretty clear association between finger length and how much testosterone you were exposed to, okay, during that period of development. Now, most men have a fourth finger that's slightly longer than their second finger, okay? The longer the fourth finger is in comparison to the second finger, the more testosterone you were exposed to during that period of fetal development, okay? Women typically have second fingers, fourth fingers that are the same in size, or sometimes the second digit is slightly longer. Okay. So this, like I say, was for a while studied in relation to sexual orientation, because on average, homosexual men have lower baseline rates of testosterone than heterosexual men, and it was also found in a number of studies that their fourth digit was shorter than heterosexual men, that they often had a second digit longer than the fourth, or the second and fourth were the same, okay? Whereas heterosexual men typically have a fourth digit longer than the second. It's not true in every case, of course, okay, but it's more often than not true. But it's also been studied in relation to aggressive behavior as one other indicator over testosterone. Okay? And we find the same findings as we do when measuring testosterone in the blood. Okay, so we have the more aggressive Canadian males were the ones whose fourth digit was even longer, okay, in comparison to the second. The same in US male undergraduates, okay. The same in how likely a man is to commit violence against their female partner. Again, the longer the fourth digit is in comparison to the second, the more likely they are to be violent. How likely you are to launch unprovoked attacks in war games in an experiment, again, predicting this aggression. And then linked to aggression in 11-year-old Chinese males as well. Okay. So measuring testosterone rates in the blood and also using this method to measure how much testosterone you were exposed to during fetal development, okay? Using both measurements, we have evidence, okay, that testosterone is linked to aggressive behavior. If you're interested, the male hormone exposure that a mother has for her developing fetus, okay, depletes essentially, okay, as you have more and more offspring. So the testosterone exposure decreases, okay, as you have more and more children. Okay. In the early 20th century, there were a number of studies finding that younger male siblings were more likely to be homosexual than older male siblings. Okay. They didn't really have any understanding of why, because they didn't really have good understanding of testosterone, ways of measuring it. The theories from psychology were kind of bizarre, trying to explain why this was. They were mainly Freudian, okay, thinking that, for example, if you grew up with many older male siblings, that might turn you gay, okay. In fact, now we know the reason for the association is because the more and more male children you have, the less and less testosterone exposure there is, okay? Now, again, it's not a one-to-one relationship, okay? Because there's many things that go into sexual orientation, okay? But it's one reliably found association. Now, if we're trying to predict aggression, unsurprisingly, we get better predictions if we take into account both testosterone and cortisol, okay? And if we look at the ratio, so having substantially higher rates of testosterone and substantially lower rates of cortisol, okay, then we get a stronger prediction of aggression rather than just using, a single measurement. Questions on testosterone?
Could you repeat the last thing you just said with cortisol and testosterone, what the ratio was for that?
I mean, effectively, just if we measure both rather than just one or the other.
Yeah.
So if you have higher rates of testosterone and lower rates of cortisol, then you're even more likely to be aggressive than just having one. Okay, neurotransmitters are other chemical messengers like hormones, except they are communicated between neurons. The neurotransmitter I really want to talk about is serotonin, okay, which is an example of a monoamine. Monoamines are neurotransmitters that have one amino acid, and they then combine with two carbon chains, okay, and then that's how the neurotransmitter is produced. So the amino acid is found in your diet, okay, and then once you consume it, it's connecting to two carbon chains, and then that provides the building blocks for the neurotransmitter in your body. And different monoamines have different amino acids that are the building blocks, but for serotonin, the building block is tryptophan, okay, that's the amino acid, that's the precursor. It's found, well, turkey is a good source for it, beans are a good source for it, okay, it can also be found in fish, egg whites, chicken, okay. Sometimes around Thanksgiving, there's articles in scientific magazines that have kind of silly headings that say, it's not eating all the food that makes you sleepy, it's the tryptophan in the turkey, or it's, not being around relatives that make you feel good, it's the tryptophan in the turkey, okay? These are silly headlines, but it is the building block, okay, for the serotonin. Now, serotonin we've talked about, but remember, it's the mood stabilizer, right? It's controlling your arousal, regulating your mood. If you have high levels of serotonin, you're content, you're satisfied, you're not very easily bothered, you're going to be pretty emotionally stable, right? If you have low levels of serotonin, you're already feeling on edge, you're going to be more volatile, more rattled, more easily provoked, right? And you can see here, it originates in various parts of the brain, and this is the pathway for it. So paying attention mainly to serotonin, which is the blue one, okay? This is the pathway of how it then is transported around the brain, okay? The red line is dopamine, which, again, you'll be familiar with, is the neurotransmitter that encourages approach behavior, right? When you pick up on incentive rewards that tell you things are going well, you get a dopamine kick to encourage you to keep on going with the behavior that you're doing because you're getting close to achieving this motivation, okay, running it to its end in a positive way. Glutamate excites neurons, and then GABA does the opposite, inhibits neurons. For most people, when you have alcohol, GABA is what is then produced. For a small number of people, they get dopamine when they consume alcohol. Probably the people who are more likely to end up getting addicted. Okay. You can see for yourself, by the way, if you get a dopamine kick from alcohol, not that I'm encouraging any of you to drink, okay? But You can measure your heart rate, you can get drunk, and then measure it again, so long as nothing has changed drastically in the environment. And if there's a substantial increase in heart rate, you've probably had a dopamine kick. The series of stages here, again, you're probably familiar with. This is intro to psych stuff. It's how neurotransmitters are communicated though from neuron to neuron. Okay, so we start off with the chemical messengers, the neurotransmitters, being stored in the terminal buttons of the axon on the neuron on the cell that's doing the communication, right? There's only three parts of the neuron. There's the cell body, there's the axon, which is like the transmitter, right? And then the dendrites, which are like the receptors, right? So an axon carries a nerve impulse, which is basically the action potential, remember? So that it's transported, right, to the ends of the axon, so it can then be released into the gap between this neuron and the next neuron, which is the synaptic cleft, right? So the chemicals are discharged. It's not, put directly into the next neuron, okay? It's put into this gap in between them, which is the synaptic cleft. And then it's picked up on by the dendrites on the next neuron, which for this is called the postsynaptic cell, right? The one that's being communicated with. And then there's some leftover chemical messengers, right? They can be broken down by enzymes. They can be reuptaken by the original cell, okay? In which case they repackage it and then can reuse it in a future action potential. So serotonin, first of all, in animals, a reduction in serotonin increases aggression in mice. Fluoxetine, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, okay? So a serotonin reuptake inhibitor is a common treatment for serotonin deficiency, right? If you have a mood disorder, depression, an anxiety disorder, you might be treated with a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so your serotonin levels are higher. So when we give this serotonin reuptake inhibitor to rats, muricide is significantly reduced, which is when rats murder mice, okay? Now, in humans, we also have good evidence, okay, that serotonin is linked to aggressive behavior, okay? In a meta-analysis of 18 studies using serotonin readings from cerebrospinal fluid, there's a moderate to strong effect on average found across these studies, okay? The lower levels of serotonin predicted more impulsive, reactive aggression, okay? Reduced serotonin characterizes violent, impulsive violence especially. This is the gene involved in the construction of serotonin, okay? There is a short allele version of this gene, which basically corresponds to a serotonin deficiency, okay? Having chronically low levels of serotonin. This variant of the gene is found at higher rates than average amongst violent offenders, okay? In multiple studies, also in Taiwan. And then serotonin reuptake inhibitors reduce aggression in people with a number of clinical disorders. Okay, so methods to reduce aggressive tendencies by stabilizing mood. Right. What about in children? So with cortisol, we found that there was a reliable connection in children, teenagers, adults. Testosterone, not so much in children, but by around 16, we're then having a reliable connection, okay? With serotonin, there's no real evidence that it predicts antisocial tendencies in children, okay? So we have 3 studies here using cerebrospinal fluid again to get a reading for serotonin. No consistent connection. The same is true for blood studies. one exception to the norm in which there was a connection between low serotonin and aggression in boys, but only when there was already an existing history, okay, of aggression present, okay, in the parental history. Now, the short allele variant on this serotonin gene, okay, that corresponds to a serotonin deficiency, really does seem to be tied to reactive impulsive aggression only. Okay. Recently, Andrea Glenn from the University of Alabama, who does work on psychopathy, has looked at psychopaths, so psychopathic offenders who committed premeditated, proactive aggression, and found that they were significantly more likely to have the long allele version than the short allele version. Okay, so they didn't have serotonin deficiency at a common rate. There is also evidence of low serotonin in the offspring of those with an antisocial personality disorder. Okay, so keeping in mind, we've looked at the genetic evidence, so you should be thinking about what features might be heritable. Is there a difference between males and females? Not entirely clear. Okay, keep in mind that female offenders are very much under-researched in comparison to male offenders, but it does seem to be the case that a serotonin deficiency impacts both males and females. Okay, whether or not there's a differing level of how much it affects is still in question. So we have a study here that found an effect for both, but it was about twice as high for the males as it was for the females. And then in another study, it affected both, and there was no significant difference between the males and females, okay, in terms of the effect. Any questions so far? So why might it be the case that low levels of serotonin predict reactive aggression? Well, again, serotonin is a mood stabilizer, sometimes described as the brakes on a car, right? If you have low levels of serotonin, then you're more impulsive and you're more rattled and more easily provoked. If we reduce serotonin by removing the amino acid from people's diets, okay, there's effects that come from this. The orbitofrontal cortex is less functional. Again, I'm going to talk about parts of the brain next week, but the orbitofrontal cortex is a part of the prefrontal cortex, basically above the eyes, heavily involved in impulse control. Okay. The Nogel task, if you're not familiar, is also a way of measuring impulse control. You're told, press this key when this thing appears on the screen. So you're pressing this key, you're pressing this key, you're pressing this key, but don't press it when this other similar thing appears on the screen. If you're highly impulsive, you'll keep on pressing it, okay, even when you're not supposed to. So those who had the tryptophan removed from the diet performed worse on the no-go task, more impulsive, and a less functioning orbitofrontal cortex, okay, also indicating more impulsivity. Other evidence, okay, reducing serotonin by removing tryptophan from the diet, again, resulting in more reactive aggression. In terms of what causes a serotonin reduction, other than the influence from genes, okay, another potential reason could be maternal deprivation, okay. This is a study on rheus monkeys, so it needs to be further explored. But we have rheus monkeys, a group of which are raised by their biological mother, a group of which are removed from their mother's care, and then basically left to be raised by non-relatives, by peers. Okay, there's a 10 to 23% reduction in serotonin throughout the brain in the group who experienced the maternal deprivation in comparison to those who were raised by their biological mother. I want to bring back in the MAOA gene because remember, this is involved in the reuptake of serotonin and the low activity variant we've talked a lot about. Well, if you have this low activity variant of the gene, on average, it also corresponds with an 8% reduction in the amygdala and with the orbitofrontal cortex again. They also have less orbitofrontal activity during the no-go task. Okay, so the orbitofrontal cortex is structurally different, it's smaller, and it's functionally different, it's less active. And there's also exaggerated neural responses when you have this variant of the gene in response to social rejection, okay? Again, indicating that those with this gene that, again, often corresponds with a serotonin deficiency means that you're more easily provoked, right, and more reactive. The ATC, by the way, is the angulate cingulate cortex, but I'm going to, again, come back to all these parts of the brain, okay? I'll quickly tell you about a case here, and then I'll ask you to do some quick research of your own and think about your thoughts on this case. But this man, sometimes called Jimmy the Fuse, was raised in a pretty normal environment. It was parents who were at least middle class, who were well educated, nothing really dramatic. But from an early age, there were clear antisocial tendencies. He would get into fights with his brothers. Once it was so bad, he bit the ear off his brother. He got kicked out of Catholic school for beating up a nun, and a number of other examples of violent episodes. Okay. Then later, as an adult, he faced separation from his wife, didn't take it very well, harassed her, and then escalated and got worse until he eventually murdered her. Okay. He was then facing the death penalty for this, but his defense found he suffered from a serotonin deficiency, something that might help explain his mood, his impulsivity, his reactivity. And this can be treated with a serotonin reuptake inhibitor with medication. Okay, we can treat serotonin deficiencies, making one less dangerous potentially, okay, if that really is explaining their problem, okay? So the argument here was that this person should be spared the death penalty given diminished responsibility, okay? What I'd like you to do is, in small groups of 3 or 4, look up the case by Googling his name and think then about what you maybe would have thought yourself about the case if you were on the jury, if you were listening to this argument. And then we'll talk about what actually happened and whether the argument was persuasive or not.